Sent to the principal's office begins as a deceptively simple setup. A young woman, Shyla, caught somewhere she shouldn't be, behind a desk that doesn't belong to her. But the scene unfolds into something much deeper and more emotionally resonant, particularly when read through a queer, woman-centered lens. What starts as a power struggle between a student and a principal quickly becomes a layered exploration of identity, belonging, and the unspoken emotional codes that govern how women interact in spaces that are supposed to be safe, structured, and professional. When Shyla is first seen behind the desk, looking through India's phone, it's a moment that immediately communicates curiosity but also longing, not for mischief, but for proximity. The act of looking isn't about violation, it's about reaching towards someone who seems to have everything she doesn't. Confidence, authority, self-possession. When India returns and catches her, the dynamic flips. Shyla's brief illusion of control evaporates, and what's left is vulnerability. The tension between them is palpable not because of overt flirtation, but because of how human it feels. Two women navigating an emotional power exchange that society doesn't often allow them to explore without judgment. India's authority and Shyla's defiance mirror something universal in womanhood, the constant negotiation between being seen and being disciplined for wanting to be seen. India's question, whether Shyla knows why she's in the office, functions on two levels. On the surface, it's a disciplinary inquiry. Beneath it, it's an existential one. Does Shyla understand why she feels compelled to blur boundaries, to exist in spaces where she doesn't belong? Does she recognize the deeper yearning driving her actions? The hunger for recognition, for belonging, for being understood by another woman who might see through her armor? When India reveals that Shyla is not a student at all, but a 25-year-old pretending to be in high school, the narrative becomes a metaphor for identity performance. For many queer women, especially those who came of age hiding parts of themselves, Shyla's deception echoes the emotional survival tactics they've used in their own lives. Pretending to fit in, adapting to heteronormative environments, or revisiting past versions of oneself in an attempt to heal unacknowledged pain. All of these are familiar queer experiences. Shyla's impulse to relive her teenage years isn't about regression. It's about trying to reclaim a version of herself that never got to exist fully the first time. For queer viewers, especially women who found their queerness later in life, her decision to return to school symbolizes a longing for do-over, not of academics, but of emotional adolescence. That period when love and identity were censored, before they even had a chance to bloom. India, in turn, becomes the embodiment of institutional power, the system's voice of order. But there's complexity beneath her sternness. When she tells Shyla that she doesn't belong in this school, it resonates as both literal and symbolic. She's saying what the world so often tells queer people, you don't belong here. And yet, there's a strange tenderness in her confrontation, as if she's protecting Shyla from something harsher. The consequences of staying hidden for too long. India's position mirrors the double bind many women face, to enforce the rules of the world while simultaneously understanding the emotional cost those rules inflict on other women. When she demands the truth, what she's really asking is for authenticity, for Shyla to stop performing and start revealing. Shyla's confession that she's failed at most things, that she still lives with her parents and can't seem to find purpose, strips away all pretense. It's a raw moment of self-awareness that resonates with women who've been told that success equals worth. Shyla's nostalgia for high school, for simpler times, isn't immaturity, it's grief for lost possibility, for the parts of her identity that were never allowed to grow. Many queer women, particularly those who discovered or accepted their sexuality later, understand this grief intimately. It's not just missing youth, it's mourning the youth that could have been, had they been allowed to live it freely. In this way, Shyla represents the emotional limbo of arrested development that often comes with repression. India's response, firm but empathetic, reflects another truth about womanhood, how women often become each other's mirrors, reflecting the choices and compromises they've made. India's authority feels earned, but it's also isolating. She's built her stability within the system, and in confronting Shyla, she's reminded of what she gave up to do so. Their dynamic becomes almost generational, as if India is both an adversary and a future version of Shyla, the woman who learned to control what once made her vulnerable. The conversation about what's right and wrong transforms into a meditation on integrity, not just moral integrity, but emotional honesty. When India accuses Shyla of exploiting the system, it mirrors how society often frames queer self-expression as deceit or deviance. To exist authentically, women like Shyla are accused of taking up space that wasn't made for them. But India's insistence on truth is not punishment, it's liberation. She's urging Shyla to see that the desire to relive the past is only understandable if it leads to forward motion. The subtext of this entire exchange. The pull between them, the intensity of their eye contact, the shared emotional gravity, speaks to queer intimacy as something deeper than physicality. It's about recognition. Queer women watching this might see in India's gaze the cautious empathy of someone who recognizes herself in another's recklessness. They might see in Shyla's pleading the universal queer ache for acceptance. For someone older, wiser, or more grounded to say, "I see you and you're not broken." The beauty of this scene lies in how it refuses to sensationalize that connection. There's no fantasy here, no taboo. It's simply two women confronting the truth of who they are in each other's presence. Yet even that simple act carries tension because society is still uncomfortable watching two women share emotional intensity without filtering it through heteronormative expectations. When India's authority softens and she listens to Shyla's story, it challenges the stereotype that women's power must come at the cost of empathy. Their dynamic subverts the traditional hierarchy. The principal is supposed to dominate, but here, vulnerability becomes the true form of power. Shyla's honesty changes the balance, and India's willingness to engage with her emotionally, rather than dismissing her, creates a space of mutual recognition. For queer audiences, this moment feels radical because it portrays female connection as emotionally charged yet completely safe for work, proving that intimacy doesn't need to be sexualized to be meaningful. It reclaims what the male gaze often distorts, that the emotional labor women do for each other is as potent as any romantic confession. The scene also invites reflection on why society still struggles with images of women in emotional proximity. The discomfort lies in what these moments expose: the truth that women's bonds, whether romantic or platonic, have the power to challenge the systems that depend on their separation. India's role as the disciplinarian represents those systems: education, order, professionalism. Shyla's role as the rule breaker represents emotion, chaos, rebellion. Together, they embody a dialogue between conformity and freedom that queer women have lived for generations. By the time Shyla asks if there's anything she can do to stay, the line transcends its literal meaning. She's not just asking to stay in school, she's asking for belonging, for the right to exist in a world that keeps pushing her out. India's silence in response feels like the emotional climax. It's heavy, reflective, compassionate, and unresolved. She doesn't say no, but she doesn't say yes either. That ambiguity mirrors how queer connection often exists in coded gestures and unfinished sentences, in the tension between what's said and what can't be. Sent to the principal's office ultimately becomes a metaphor for queer coming of age. Not the first one in youth, but the quieter, more painful one that happens in adulthood, when you finally face who you are and who you've pretended to be. For women and LGBTQ+ viewers, it resonates as a story of emotional reclamation, learning that it's never too late to rewrite your own narrative. In its restrained performances and quiet tension, the scene honors something profoundly real: the way two women, even across lines of power and propriety, can find in each other the permission to be honest. And in a world still uneasy with women's emotional autonomy, that honesty becomes its own form of revolution.